Good afternoon. Well, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to Hakeem and his group here for the foresight. This conversation is so timely. The other Americas still separate, still unequal, given where we are as a nation. Again, I'm Bankole Thompson. I'm a columnist at the Detroit News, among other things. I am interested in all things politics, because I always believe it was said that seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you. The panelists we've had from this distinguished group of individuals throughout the whole day today about race, poverty, and all the debilitating factors that are affecting us as a nation. What we want to do now is to engage in a real banter with you in terms of questions that you may ask. And I do a lot of these around town, and I always tell people in the audience, crave their indulgence, that when you stand to speak, we know how you really feel, but if you can just edit your commentary or your editorial and just go straight to the questions and don't give us a PhD thesis in terms of how you feel about issues. Let the experts here deal with. Let's give them that, the due, right? So I want to begin. I have my own set of questions here for our distinguished panel. I think they've done a wonderful job throughout the day here talking to you and, providing research, of course, and citing studies and citing different chapters of the last 50 or the last 100 years in terms of where this nation has been and the political pivot that this nation continues to do. I want to take us back to 1967 at Stanford University, the panel. Dr. King gave a speech there titled, I think it was April 14th, before he headed to Riverside Church in New York to give the speech about the war in Vietnam. At Stanford University, Dr. King talked about the other America, and he talked about the other America, one where there's milk flowing, and there's the other America where there really basically are no opportunities. The question here is, 50 years after Dr. King's speech about the other America, and let's also remember, it was around the same time with Lyndon Johnson's The Great Society program and so forth. 5 decades after that, when you look at where we are as a nation, to the panel, have we made any progress? Have we made little progress? Or have we taken 2 steps backward? Any of you could answer that.
I mean, I would date the closure of racial progress at around the mid to late 1970s. So I would argue that there was indeed some progress subsequent the speech that Martin Luther King made. But if we move fast forward to around right before the decade of 1980s, there's virtually been no relative progress between black-white inequality. And then, I talked about wealth a lot when I presented. Frankly, in terms of wealth, we haven't had progress since antebellum, prior to which blacks were literally capital of whites.
Can we get another perspective? 5 decades after Dr. King's speech at Stanford, the other America, have we made progress? Have we made little progress? Or have we taken 2 steps backwards?
It seems to me obvious that in certain ways we've made some progress, but overall I'm going to agree with my co-panelists that we've taken steps backwards. I know that, for example, I did a study of media portrayal of the poor, and in the early to mid 1960s, it was common to portray the poor in a way that portrayed their poverty as a result of systemic factors. And systematically, from about 1967 further and further on, poverty has been portrayed as the result of individual failings. And that stingy portrayal, that stingy frame of poverty, has been statistically correlated with less and less spending in proportion to the severity of poverty in the United States. So poverty has been racialized, people have been stigmatized, and I think it's fair to say that in that example, we have gone backwards.
Let's get another voice. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Well, I think in Michigan, two clear things that have happened since I've been living in Michigan that seem to be very significant steps backward was the attack on affirmative action in Michigan. And the second one was the draconian emergency manager policy that was put into place, where there is, I know at least one peer-reviewed published study that demonstrates that the emergency manager law has been applied mostly to African-American cities in Michigan, and African-Americans in generally are more affected by the emergency manager law than white residents. And there's no, when you think about what happened in the Flint water crisis and the role of the emergency managers and the fact that two of them that presided over Flint during the crisis have been indicted, we really need to take a very strong look at that policy. We need to look at who's coming up with policies like that. It seemed to me very odd that there was a citizens initiative that tried to rescind an earlier law, and then it was quickly rephrased and made initiative proof. It couldn't be put on an initiative ballot, and it's hard for me to believe that that was not part of a well laid out plan because it happened so quickly. And one of the things I've always wanted to do, which I haven't had time, but if anybody has any interest in doing this, is to look at the history of the source of the emergency manager law in Michigan.
Go ahead.
So, I think that questions in terms of evaluations of progress are always relative. For me, in terms of the time frame that I look at, I think that there has been progress, right? I think the question is always about how much progress has actually been made in the history of this country and the history of black people in particular. So obviously, and I've said this before, I focus at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and I'm not gonna sit here and say in 2018 that like we've backslid and things like that. It's crazy because I would not be here and this panel would not look like this and this room would not look like this, right? We are definitely not where we need to be. But for me to say that like progress has not been made is also, I can't do that because so many people have come before and fought for certain rights that I have. I think that obviously the political and legal rights that individuals fought for and that were achieved in the 20th century, they didn't accomplish all that many people hoped they would, but they never would. But I don't think that many of us also really thought that they could. But I think even in terms of not achieving, whether it is full voting rights, education, and or the protection of life for African Americans, I still think that these things were incredibly important and are still important to organizers right now on the ground. We're not where we should be. We probably have backslid if you look at the last five years, 10 years, but in terms of...
So let me push that.
Yeah.
If King were to give that, if we were to replay, because the theme here is born out of that speech, if in fact Dr. King were to give that speech here in the Union House, today, would you find that speech more relevant today than back then?
More relevant today than back then?
Yeah. Would you find the speech that Dr. King gave on the Other America more relevant to where we are today as a nation than 50 years ago?
I think it's still relevant. I don't think it's more relevant then. I mean, I think I could ask you, throw a question right on back and say,
right.
Ida B. Wells did a talk in 1896, right, in terms of talking about the protection of black lives. Is it more relevant then or is it more relevant now? We can do this back and forth, right? But I think at the end of the day that one of the things that needs to be made clear, right, is that I think progress is a continual struggle, right? I don't think, I mean, in terms of the Other America, that was definitely the case when King spoke then. It's definitely the case now, by all means, absolutely, right? But I think that, but at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge the progress that has been made and how much also that we also need to do, and also the shortfalls in these political and also the so-called legal guarantees that we do or we do not have.
Right.
That's my only point there.
Right. And I'm asking this question, this thought-provoking questions, having it at the back of my mind. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a report came out about 4 years ago indicating that, in fact, we have plunged into poverty since that program was created to put a stopgap, to poverty. Go ahead.
Two things. One,
right.
One is, I really think it's in some ways about where we're at the moment, in that we live in this moment in which I'm 47, there's things I haven't seen before that are happening at this moment. And so part of it is not just where we've come, but the fear of where we might be going, right? I think it's both a fear and a hope that,
right.
that if at this moment we could take this great struggle that we're having as a nation and build on what Martin Luther King and others did, then it will be a great society. But on the other hand, we could go right back to the time periods that you were studying if we're not careful. It seems to be that tenuous at the moment. Now, as far as the economics go, I believe that we've been on a downward spiral for several decades. And if we, again, don't make adjustments at this point in time, 10 years from now when we talk about this, we really could be thinking about it's worse than what it was since, from whenever, right? I think we're really at that moment. We're either going to make decisions to fight for what we believe and what we want the country to look like, or the country's going to go in a direction we don't want it to go. And there really is no other option. I never felt more pressed in my life to be more than an academic, right?
Right.
It is not enough for us at this moment in history to live our daily lives. We have to find ways to fight and to fight back and to understand that it is a fight. It is not just like times past where you can sit down, compromise, and rationalize. There has to be a push from below to change the system, because the system is clearly going in the wrong direction, whether we're worse off than what it was. If we don't do something now, this conversation will look a lot different.
Yeah, let's get some more voices. Go ahead.
So the question could be a methodological question. How much, if it has happened,
right.
And it has a policy implication. Meaning, if I tell you that there's no change, then that it's going to push you to do something. And if I tell you that there has been change, then that gives you an excuse to not do something. And so I think we have to think about, when we ask these questions of social movements, I think that's really the underlying question of, we have to think about the ideas, the assumptions we make about.
But you don't think we can measure the movement, though?
We can't measure the movement. That's not my concern. My question is about the assumptions we make of time.
Okay.
Okay? We can go back at any point of time and use it as a baseline. The question is, what is the society we want to live in? And we have to acknowledge Professor Kendi of American University states we've always been in a struggle between a racial ideology and a racist ideology. And so I'm actually not willing to concede that we are losing. I think that we have always been in struggle. There has been a Black consciousness, indigenous consciousness, Latinx consciousness movements that are always in the fight. And we have, as a society, in some ways, conceded power to make decisions to people who have a particular idea about how society should distribute resources. That society is linked to financialization, deregulation. I mean, I'm just going to call it out. And it has an impact on us, because in our society, we accepted, in our society, at the beginning of the US.
I like where you're going. So let's find out here what's the response to this. And because this is Martin Luther King Jr. Week, so forgive me, I'm going to invoke or inject a lot of Kingian thinking here. Dr. King, in his last speech at Memphis, I've been to the mountaintop. When he was speaking, if you listen to the speech, he sounded like a man resigned to fate. He was calling for an economic boycott. He came out in defense of the First Amendment. But I was listening to him talking about the need for, ministers of the gospel to step up and do something and stop just, confined behind their pulpits and using high-sounding language, the heavens here and there and all of that. But he sounded like a man resigned to fate, and one of the things that really stood out for me was the mass economic boycott that Dr. King was pointing towards too. The question in this era is, what is the response to the problems that we face today that have confined us to the other America? What is the response? What should the response be?
I'll wrap up my response here. I think there is an unfinished civil rights agenda, and it has to do with economic justice. We, as a society, when we started this nation, we agreed to take labor from people and not pay them. And we have not recompensed that first sin. And until we do, we are going to have a movement towards justice that we are going to have to push from the bottom to hold those in power accountable for the ideologies of democracy, the ideologies of meritocracy and fairness that are given out, but that actually don't exist, the hypocrisy issues.
All right, let's get some more voices in this conversation. And I'm coming to the audience in 15 minutes, so get your questions ready.
Well, I would add to that call for reparations, which is what I heard there, a call for reckoning with mass criminalization. So one place where we are much worse off is that there are 2 million people in cages. There are 7 million people under the control of the criminal legal system. There are 10 million arrests every single year. In each of those categories, black people are grossly overrepresented. And criminalization is now the way in which the state exercises more and more control over us and gets in the way and impedes progress on every front, and particularly economic progress, and targets poor people and low-income black people in ways that are about criminalizing poverty. So I think for me, and then it's also in police interactions. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, police officers killed more people now than they did in the time of King. If I'm not mistaken, we kill more people on death row now than we did then. No? Okay, good. I'm glad there's...
Then, yeah.
Yes, okay, then. So, we need to carefully look at that, and then also the reality is that many police interactions that I describe in my book are also described in Sarah Haley's book, described in 1987, right? Or sorry, in 1897. So basically, you can look at police interactions between black women and police, and they look the same in 1867, in 1967, in 2017, and literally you could read the description and not know which year that happened in. And so for me, that's where, in addition to sort of the economic reparations, the social, cultural, spiritual reparations, really we need to do this reckoning with where we are with the criminal legal system or the mass criminalization, because otherwise the rest is not going to progress.
All right, we have 2 mics here, so can we?
Can I just make?
Okay, go ahead.
Could I just make a quick comment to what
Sure.
you just said?
And then we'll come to him.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the point about the mass incarceration, because the point, criminalization, well, the incarceration also goes along with that. I used to naively believe that once somebody served their prison sentence, they served their debt and they get all their rights back. And I found out, that was some time ago, but I was very surprised that if you've been convicted, you lose your voting rights. So if you have a disproportionate number of African-American men in prison, it really raised the question in my mind, is that a strategy to disenfranchise African-Americans? And if we think about voter suppression, the excessive gerrymandering that we tend to have, my understanding, well, it's more of a question because I haven't looked at the data, but I want to raise the question is, to what extent does a city like Detroit get as many precincts per person and number of voting machines as people in Ann Arbor? And I do think that African Americans were very motivated in 2008 and 2012 to come out for Barack Obama and stayed many hours in line. In Ann Arbor, most of my adult life, I'm in and out of the poll in about 10 minutes. And so, I have questions, and so there's a lot, these are subtle things. So I believe we've made progress. I think that the civil rights laws of the 1960s hit head on the most blatant versions of discrimination, but I have questions about whether more subtle forms of discrimination have taken its place, and whether we should be on guard about the erosion of civil rights through those efforts.
Well, I guess I think that if we had really made the progress we were capable of, we wouldn't be sitting here today in this conference. There would have been no need for the conference. I think the other side has made some progress. They have the White House. That's a fairly good catch. And the issues that we're talking about are frequently on the defensive. You think about the resources that have been brought to fight ISIS, which is a true threat to our national security, our national well-being. Have a fraction of those resources been utilized in a fraction of the time to address the sorts of concerns that we're talking about today? To me, the measurement of progress is not comparing now to 1963, but rather what we're capable of now compared to what we were capable of in 1963. Some of the schools I just spoke, I hope, Fanta, you'll talk to the group. I just spoke to this remarkable young woman from Jalen Rose who was telling me that her school, what'd you tell me, you had one book that you took home from one course, and you had whole courses where you didn't have teachers? That doesn't meet Plessy versus Ferguson. That doesn't meet the standard of Plessy versus Ferguson. And you look at what we could be doing, that we are still debating the same subject matters that we were debating in 1963. That's not progress. I guess the last thing I'd say is that, you know, Dr. King was part of a movement, part of a march on Washington. It was the discourse of this nation. It was the conversation of this nation. Ask yourself if that's what's happening today. Ask yourself who's controlling social media, who's controlling the conversations that are taking place today, who's the one, what are the subjects that we're really talking about as a nation, and are those subjects really relevant to the lives of the marginalized groups? By this time, there ought not to be anything as a marginalized group or a marginalized individual, and we're overrun by it today. So progress, I don't know, but I know that we're nowhere close to where we could be if we were really committed to dealing with this as a national movement.
Go ahead.
I want to say two things. One, I think it's really important in the context of thinking about the other America is to think about the growth in inequality. So one of the key features of the American economy over the last 40 years is the massive growth in inequality. So for some people, they are doing a lot better. Right. But then for others, they're doing a lot worse. And I think it's really critical to think about how that contributes to the divide. The other thing, I want to just give an example of sort of, you know, what's the potential and where's progress. And this comes from an experience I had when I first moved to the state of Texas. So at the time, I had an 8-year-old, she's now 11, who has a series of health issues and which required her to be out of school. And so the first thing I did when I got there was found a pediatrician, but she missed some school. And so she missed 3 days of school in the first week. And I got a letter saying that she was truant. She was considered truant. And I thought, what does this mean? And if she's truant, if this continues, you're going to have to go to court. And I said, what does that mean? And so it turns out, so the state of Texas, the juvenile justice system was under great scrutiny. It was egregious cases of abuse. And so the state made a concerted effort to reform the juvenile justice system. The juvenile justice, the number of children being held in juvenile facilities declined, in detention declined by 75%, from 4,500 to less than 1,000 in a very short window of time. Everyone viewed it as progress. So at the same time, the state started charging students who were truant in adult criminal court. So students and their parents could be required to appear in adult criminal court and be fined $200, $400, $600. So, and the year that I moved to Texas in 2013, there were 115,000 cases of students being charged for truancy. Now, this got the attention of a number of different organizations, Appleseed, the ACLU, and they brought this to the attention of the media, to the legislature, and legislation was passed to change the law. So this is no longer legal to charge students with truancy, to send them to adult criminal court. But I want to say, in my field work in the last 9 months, in courts just outside of major metro areas, we observed children and their parents in adult criminal court being charged on a very related charge, not the same charge, but a very related charge, and I feel it's my responsibility to force some accountability, right? And to ask questions and to get people to examine, question, bring this back to the legislature, and hold people accountable. So I think that's where I see some progress.
So let me explore this a little bit further down, and we'll come to the audience here. So 5 decades ago, the way we shared information, you either turn on the news and listen to Walter Cronkite bringing you information about the Pentagon Papers and the latest, or people come out in mass movements and demonstrate, or you get to read the newspapers, wait for your hard copy, and so forth. In 2018, we've seen, of course, this a robust, emergence, if you will, of technology, social media, and so forth. Facebook and Twitter, we're tweeting live as we speak. How much of that, or how much of social media do you think has had influence, positive or negative, on the movement for social action?
I could say that it's had almost no impact. It's changed the form.
It's had no impact?
No impact. It's changed the form. But when we talk about everything that's just been said, when you listen to those are uncorrelated statistically with the emergence of social media. The trends have been going on for quite some time. And like Attorney Rosenberg-Baum mentioned, the other side is fighting back. And I think we have made a terrible error in attributing racism to racists. And I know that those of us in the room understand the difference between personal, attitudinal racism and systemic difference. And I think so far it appears to me that we have pretty much lost the battle, which means the other side has won the battle, in suggesting that there might be other motivations for policies such as the ones that you described about criminalizing juvenile truancy or missing a few days of class. Why would that be criminalized? Most likely there's some kind of deep racial motivation for that, but it's not explicitly laid out in the record. And if it's not in the record, most courts will not rule that it has been, that it's illegal. For example, it's very clear, and I didn't get to talk about this earlier, it's very clear that the death penalty is racially disparate in its application. It's also extremely clear that attorneys on the state side, which is the government, systematically exclude blacks and other minorities from juries, systematically, for no other reason than their race. But unless they say, I'm going to exclude this one because she's black, unless they put that on the record, and these are attorneys after all, and district attorneys, and the people that are working in the Attorney General's office or people at the DA's office, they don't tend to put things like that in writing in a legal brief. But unless they do, there's nothing that can be done about it according to the court. The court was presented in 1987 with overwhelming evidence that black defendants in criminal trials were 4 times more likely to get death in the state of Georgia. And the court said, prove it, Mr. Attorney, in the case of your individual client, and show me the racial animus on the part of the jury or the judge. And if you can't show that on the record, then it's fine. So I don't think that has anything to do with social media.
No, the social media, I asked the social media question in terms of the other America, because we're speaking right now. In 1950, you would have waited for the New York Times or the Detroit News to report what transpired here, and then the information would saturate. But right now we're speaking, and there are people following us on Twitter and on Facebook. The question is, the more informed you are, do you become more empowered, or do you think that has nothing to do with it? Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is I think it's a great question. And I'll tell you three things. One, we have to think about how systems work, right? How systems of inequality work. Systems of inequality don't care what the mechanism are. It uses whatever mechanism it needs in order to produce inequality, because that's what the system wants to do, right? So what has happened in the last, so I'm considered like the Zennial generation. When I was in college, there was no Facebook. Right, there was no one running around with smartphones in high school and so on and so forth. Right. And then everything has changed, all right? Now what has happened, and from personal experience, what has happened is that technology has allowed for people to see things and get information that they would not otherwise get because of the isolation they experience from that systematic inequality. So I have a paper that came out in the Journal of Health, Politics, Policy, and Law, with my co-authors, Keon Gilbert and Rashawn Ray, and we find that those more sophisticated mobile technology users, people who have an iPad and a smartphone that's connected to the internet, they actually are more likely to engage with the healthcare system. They're more likely to report better health. They report better trust. And they basically are what we would assume to be like an intervention point, right? We would think that technology can then be used to reduce inequality. But what we have found, right, to your point, right. Last fall, I was engaged with, and I would say the last 2 years, I've been engaged in social media campaigns. One is called the Race and Policing Project at Race and Policing Project, and the other one is called hashtag Stand Up and Speak Out. And they're both ways in which we use social media to bring about awareness of the inequalities that we're facing, because people do not know. Now, what has happened with both of these projects is that people have tried to shut them down. In the first case, people said, well, you don't have the right to distribute information that another person owns, right? So we've said, okay, we'll get smart. We'll just produce our own kind of rendition of the things. And with the Stand Up and Speak Out campaign, we had over 100 professors across the nation, across the globe, for 1 week, get up in their classrooms and read a statement that was basically, we would denounce the racism, the bigotry of this current administration, and we will do what we need to do as educators to do this. And all of these people are responding to literal physical threats to their lives that they are experiencing, not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. And so it works both ways. Right. We have to be there to get the information out to people who need it, and we have to be ready for the resistance that comes through technology.
And I ask that question because I believe it's part of the larger menu here of this discourse about the other America. And honestly, if you don't think social media has anything to do with it, maybe look into Russia and Facebook, you'll find out the 2016 election. But anyway, we will not litigate that here. Go ahead, ma'am.
I mean, I do feel like in the work
and I'm coming to the audience in a minute.
In the work that I do, social media has made a difference in the sense that we are now able to get, so that I said earlier in my presentation that black women have been talking about police violence against black women for a long time, and we've been organizing against it for a long time, and it would take reading at the dark end of the street to know that, and you know, for instance, among many other things, or Sarah Haley's work or other historians' work, and it would take waiting for that to know that until now. And people often ask me, Andrea, you've been doing this work for 20 years, others have been doing this for many decades, why now is there more attention to this issue? And it is because we don't need to go through the news brokers anymore. I don't need to convince you that the police killing of Shelley Hilliard or of Ayanna Stanley Jones is worthy of a story around police violence in Detroit. I can just tell it. And we don't have to we don't have to wait for the NAACP to decide that black women matter. We just say they do, and we tell the story, and then we rally around it that way. So I think because for a long time I would dig through transcripts of testimony to the NAACP and find stories of black women. They just weren't reproducing them in their reports, or if they were, they weren't leading with that story when they went. So I feel like that's how social media has changed things. I feel like we get more stories from voices that are kept out of the sort of mainstream narrative, whether it's the mainstream black narrative, the mainstream media narrative, the mainstream whatever narrative. And I think we get more information, but I don't know that that means we act on it in ways that are deeply sustainable, right? So I think we might mobilize for a big women's march or something else through social media. I don't know that that's how we're using to build the communities that I was talking about earlier, where we're accountable to each other for safety and so forth. And I do know that we are much more surveilled now as black identity extremists through social media, right? And that when you hear that people coming into the country, social media profile is being examined, whether they're citizens or not, whether they're green card holders or not, then, and you know how I see people getting caught or being prosecuted based on Western social media, then I'm maybe more concerned about it. It's not a liberatory thing. The thing I was gonna say before about whether we've gone backwards or forwards is one place we've definitely gone backwards that we know more about because of social media, in part, is around global climate change and the way in which that's impacting disproportionately black countries and communities, right? So Puerto Rico, it's now months after Maria, and half the island still does not have power. And we know that because people in Puerto Rico are able to tell us over social media in a way that the mainstream media has way moved on from, right? And same with Flint. Little Miss Flint has us updated on the fact that we don't have clean water in Flint in a way that the mainstream media is no longer paying attention to, right? So I'm grateful for that, but also it's terrifying. You know, Kingston, Jamaica, where my family is from, is hitting some kind of global temperature tipping point in 2026, where the temperature rise will no longer be reversible. And it will be overheating there in 2026. That's 8 years from now. And the economy of a country that's already been devastated by colonialism and global restructuring and the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and just capitalism is now going to be devastated over again by climate change. And that's happening disproportionately to black countries around the world through less fault of our own than the United States. And so I feel like that's an area that is dramatic because it's going to have impact on everything: food security, economic security, living health security, that we need to pay more attention to, and that perhaps social media can be a way that we can connect with folks elsewhere around that.
Right. Thanks for putting context to that. Any more voice before I take it to the audience? Go ahead.
Can I two-finger that?
Sure.
So I love everything that's been said thus far about it. I just want to add on to two things in terms of the underbelly, I think, of social media. I think it's been a net good in so many ways, for so many of the reasons that you've mentioned here about getting the voices out, that we really don't need to go through news brokers anymore. But there is something that I feel like often doesn't get enough attention, is the ways in which the mob at some level has moved from the streets also onto social media, and the ways in which black women, in particular women of color, are often silenced through sexual violence via social media, right? And so, I don't think we have, or some of us have, but have thought about ways to deal with that level of violence, because it has a form of silencing, right? So many people who are tired of getting threats of rape just close down their social media, right? And like, that's also not a good thing to happen. Just another really very quick thing before I give up this mic. Here is this question that I love that you raised. I teach a class on race and surveillance, and so this question, the ways in which, especially on the border, at different borders, officials have used social media as a way to not let certain populations and groups of people into this country. Mostly, not always exclusively, but mostly Muslim and Arab individuals, right? And so, and they have very much done that via social media, and I think that's also something that doesn't get enough.
Any more comments? All right, let's go to the audience now. Like I indicated before, if you have an editorial or commentary, I will ask you to edit it to maybe 2 or 3 sentences and go straight to the question. So let's get as many questions as possible. And you're free to pick any of the panelists here that you may want to answer your question directly. So who do we start with? And if you can introduce yourself, tell us who you are.
Hello, my name is Rachel. I am an activist in my community. I do some organizing with college students now and other members of my community. And I'm going to pose this question to all of you, because one of the things that I love about this event is that you guys are all very involved in very different aspects of larger issues. So I really like that you all seem to be very knowledgeable in the intersection of the different things that contribute to all of these. So my question is, through my conversations with my students, with other members of the community and other activists, one of the things that I continue to hear is this sense of a lack of leadership. So looking back at past movements and past revolutions, right, we have Dr. King. You could argue that in recent years we still have rallied around Barack Obama, even the Colin Kaepernick movement, things like that. Those are smaller examples, but there's this general feeling of a lack of a person or persons that we can rally around and that can kind of unite communities in these issues. And so my question to you all is, do you think that that is an accurate perception? Is a leadership figure such as Dr. King even relevant in today's society, given social media and all of the roles that plays? And then if it is, what are the solutions and how do we begin to change that situation?
All right, thank you for being brave. Let's go.
So I have the mic, I guess I'll start. New movements like Black Lives Matter, they're redefining movements in general. So one point is that we don't necessarily have to replicate what took place in the past. There's obviously lessons to learn and new ways to go about. So, you know, I don't know if we should necessarily replicate, but nonetheless, with this pattern of greater inequality and some of the progress where blacks can now acquire leadership positions in almost every walk of life, so you always can have at least one individual in a frankly, we've become president, for instance. I think with that has come a loss of, if I borrow from my political science colleagues, a loss of linked fate, a loss of collective identity, which also has consequences. So I think that leaders are, and I put in air quotes around that, are able to be co-opted in ways that they might not have been so much in the past because of notions of collective identity and linked fate. So people, you know, black people can buy into the rhetoric of what I've been labeling neoliberalism and others as well, just as much as a white person. A black person can preside and continue policies towards inequality just like a white person could. In fact, they might be better able to do so because they dissipate movements. It's harder for the left to rally around them as a quote-unquote neoliberal because of the seemingly justice that they exemplify in their persona alone.
So while you're answering that question, though, on the question of leadership, Dr. King used to talk about manufactured leadership and the need to be aware of manufactured leadership, leadership that is created outside of, you know, mass legitimacy. Go ahead.
Can I just say, I think Dr. King and the era that he came from illustrates the pitfalls of single leaders, right, and charismatic leaders, which is one, they're killed, two, they're targets by COINTELPRO, and three, we then forget that in fact Dr. King was not alone and was backed up by hundreds of black women who actually organized the Montgomery Bucks boycott. So, right. One. Two, we are in a leader-full moment right now. And many of those leaders are black women. So I find it hard sometimes, whether you're looking at Black Lives Matter, BYP 100, Southerners on New Ground, the movement for Black Lives. And so I find it hard. People are like, where are our leaders? I'm like, oh, because you can't see us because we're women? Is that what's happening right now? So I think that, I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but it's my response to that question. And then I think the other thing is that looking for a leader to unite around, I think is dangerous for the reasons I've said, but what we've put forward instead is a vision to unite around. So if you look at the vision for Black Lives, that's something that we can unite around in many communities, under many versions of leadership that look at many different struggles, so we're not just looking on one front. So I felt passionate about answering that right now because I feel strongly that we are in a very leaderful moment, and we're in a moment where we've learned from past mistakes around charismatic leadership, and that we've learned actually from the last 8 years also, right? I mean, some of us drank a little Kool-Aid and remembered ourselves, but just remembering that we need deeper movements that are lasting over a longer term rather than one person in a particular place and thinking that that's going to get us free.
Just a quick statement. I actually remember a couple years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, asking the question, when will there be another revolution? This was before Obama. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was in their 30s. I was in my 20s at that time. And then Obama came. And we thought that that was the revolution. And what happened for me during this period of time was the idea that we all have to be leaders.
You didn't think it was a revolution?
Not really. I mean, well, you know, whatever. But the point is, we are looking for leaders in other people when we should be the ones to take responsibility to create the society that we want to see. If we continue to absolve ourselves of that responsibility, it will be in other people's control what life you live, what life your children live, and what type of inequalities continue to find themselves, grow themselves in the next generation. So I say take a responsibility.
Do I say the doors of the church are open? Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I don't consider myself an activist, but I've learned a lot in my, not just the academic work in the environmental justice issue, but also meeting a lot of the environmental justice movement leaders, and Professor Bunyan Bryant I would include among them, and I really, I just want to, I think the insights from the last two comments, this is exactly what I've seen. Not just one leader, but many leaders. And when I think about the leaders in the environmental justice movement, they're all over the country, and often they meet together. They do strategize together. They're on email lists. They come together in conferences. And it's something that I've seen push the environmental justice movement forward. So it's been a lot of different leaders. If anything that concerns me is the people that I tend to recognize as the big leaders in environmental justice, which include Professor Bryant and Bob Bullard and Beverly Wright and Charles Lee and Richard Moore, we're all mortal. We're all getting older. And so the question is, who's going to come along to fill their steps? And so I really like what was said about that. You know, we can all be leaders if we choose to be. So
I'm very interested in this discourse here, because what you're hitting at is it appears as if there's a movement away from the traditional model of civic leadership, right? Okay, we need to do something in the community. You have to talk to Hakeem. You have to talk to Bankole. You have to talk to Jennifer. You know, make sure that, you know, you get his blessing or her blessing and so forth. And now what we see, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, it's almost organic in nature, if you will. There's nobody with a big title as President General, CEO of 10,000 PhDs, that kind of thing. It's very organic, and they meet, but they're still influential in what they're doing. But on the traditional model, though, and I'll give you a quick example and let you finish. In Detroit, where I am, and I write about leadership a lot and poverty, we have, and I think every major black city has this, we have what we call black civic leadership. You know, the folks that you go to, the head of the NAACP, the head of the Urban League, you know, the head of, you know, so-and-so organization. And my critique of some of these organizations, like the Urban League, I'll tell you is, you know, I honestly, you know, don't see much that has been done in Detroit on the question of social equity. Now, I hear about the Warriors dinner every year. You know, I go and eat chicken and so forth and, you know, have a great time and celebrate so and so for receiving awards. But throughout the remaining 364 days, you don't see any kind of movement towards what was discussed here today. Detroit, classic example, is the largest poverty city of any major city in the nation, according to the 2016 census report. There's grinding poverty, there's economic inequality in the city, but then the question of economic inequality doesn't come up among civic leadership in the city. So do you now abdicate that? Do you move away from that model and depend on the Black Lives Matter movement and other groups that actually don't feel that, that they're connected to the power structure or don't feel, quote unquote, co-opted by the power structure and can freely speak and freely criticize the mayor or political leadership?
Well, if I'm following your argument, again, the movement I'm most familiar with is the environmental justice movement, and that's really the only one I feel like confident to speak of. I don't see anyone that's in a role that suggests top-down leadership.
Okay.
In fact, the motto for the movement is we speak for ourselves, and there's been a resistance actually to create a national organization. Some people would say, well, you know, that movement could use it because look at environmental organizations, any kind of other issue, there's a central organization that they're in Washington because they're near the sources of power and they can lobby. There's no formal national organization on environmental justice. Okay. But there are a lot of leaders, and the leaders know each other. It's not a guess. They know each other. They meet fairly, I would say they meet at least once a year, and certain times they meet more frequently than that. What I see the leadership, and again, I see many leaders, is are people who come up with ideas and inspire other people, right, and channel the drives and the energy of others. So I don't see, at least in the environmental justice movement, I don't see the top-down kinds of.
I raised it because I feel that this is something that we have to deal with. I'll give you a quick example and you can speak. So Charles Williams is the president of the Michigan chapter of the National Action Network, led by Reverend Al Sharpton out of New York. And I wrote a column about him in 2016 because during the 2016 presidential campaign, there was this schism, if you will, between Harry Belafonte and John Lewis. John Lewis, a prophet of the civil rights movement, came out and questioned Bernie Sanders' civil rights credentials. I didn't see him at the March in Washington. Harry Belafonte came out, an elder statesman of the movement, said, well, there were lots of people there. How can you point out and know who was there? Harry Belafonte gives a ringing endorsement of Bernie Sanders. So there was this back and forth in terms of, does Hillary Clinton own the exclusive real estate of black political leadership, and does Bernie Sanders have any inkling or any issue on that? So Reverend Charles Williams' National Action Network went to New York for a meeting. It was supposed to be young activists around the country meet with Hillary, and they were eager to ask the candidate questions, and this was held at the offices of Mark Morial, the CEO of the National Urban League. When they got in there, they were whisked in for 7 minutes, take photos, and they whisked out. So they moved away, walking angry and upset that this was just, but then there was a big press conference, Hillary Clinton with black political leadership, and that was it. Go ahead.
I have a little bit different take on this. I agree with the position that has been widely expressed on the panel that you don't need a single leader. I'm old enough, I remember Dr. King. I was fortunate to actually work with Mrs. King, and I saw the power of that leadership. But I do agree that there is a risk, for all the reasons that were stated and more, in investing all your hopes and all your, good thoughts and belief as to how to go forward with one individual or even a small group of individuals. There's a great scene in Spartacus where the Romans are coming after Spartacus and they're asking, which one of you is Spartacus? And everyone in the group, all the slaves in the group stand up and say, I am Spartacus, and that is the correct model. However, that's not the same thing in my judgment as having a plan, a strategy. I don't think that we can win with each leader having his or her own strategy. I'm not saying that's what's taking place, but I am saying that I do think we're suffering because we don't have a plan of action, we don't have a strategy to go forward with that, and I don't think that we can get lots of small victories. I am skeptical of whether or not we can get to the progress that you were talking about at the beginning unless we're all mobilized. We all make some compromises, but we're all mobilized behind a plan that we think collectively will succeed. Until that happens, I'm very, very worried as to what the success will be.
Let me take some more questions here. Let's go to the audience. Go ahead.
So I have 3 students that would like to ask a question.
Great,
So here's the
let's
first
go.
one.
Hello, my name is Kai Johnson, freshman at Jalen Rose Leadership Academy in Detroit. My question is directed towards Dr. Ritchie, and the question is, how are black women treated differently by the police in the state than from black men?
Thank you for conferring a doctorate on me. I appreciate it. Not a doctor, though. In many of the same ways, in many different ways. No, and you had no way of knowing that, so I'm joking with myself, really. So, so black women experience police violence in many of the same ways that men do in terms of driving while black, physical violence, false arrest, etc. And then black women experience police violence in gender-specific ways, particularly sexual violence, strip searches, cavity searches, and also racial profiling in gender-specific contexts, specifically the policing of prostitution, where there's huge racial disparities, where black women are consistently and constantly profiled as being engaged in prostitution, in child welfare enforcement, where a white mom leaves a kid alone in a park for 15 minutes while she runs the store, nothing happens. A black mom leaves a kid at home upstairs while she goes downstairs to get diapers and her kid's taken away, right? And she's criminalized. Those kinds of racial profiling, racially disparate enforcement in the child welfare system is something that we don't pay attention to. So, but black women are the fastest growing prison population right now, and black women are incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. So there's a lot going on in police interactions that are driving that, and those are just a few of the examples. Also, black girls in schools are experiencing huge levels of sexual harassment by police in the schools, ticketing for basically speaking up or coming to school dressed in a way someone disapproves of, or being framed as disorderly. So I feel like those are like young black boys and young black girls are experiencing school push out, but it's around different kinds of things, I think.
All right, let's get another question.
Hi, my name is Trinity Jackson. I'm in the 9th grade, and my question is for Dr. Rosenbaum. So do you think that since we don't have as many resources now in high school, that when we do get later on in life, the people who do, if that changes, will have more control over things? You get what I'm saying?
Could you repeat the end of your question? I didn't hear the last part of what you said. You said where the resources are different than. Could you just finish your question again?
Oh, people okay, my question was, do you think that people who have different resources than we do now, later on in life, will affect our future?
I do. I think that I think that the desire, the willingness to learn doesn't change from generation to generation. I think having the opportunities which resources bring, like more teachers like your teacher who brought you here today, I think that makes a difference. I'm not talking about shiny Olympic-sized swimming pools. I'm talking at minimum as to the basics. Wherever your dream is, you ought to have a place. So someone came up to me during the break and said, we don't even talk about having arts or music or those sorts of programs in the schools. Having those opportunities do make a difference. They made a difference in my life, and they make a difference in all individuals. So yeah, I think it makes a huge difference, and I think it also reflects the fact that when you talk about the way black girls are looked at, the fact that your school doesn't have those sorts of resources says, despite anything you can do or say, that you are not regarded as an equal citizen with the same capacity to change. And I think that is toxic. I think that has real effect, and I just don't see any way around it other than to make sure that those basic resources are part of every demand by every citizen. It's a great question.
Hi, my name is Anaya. I'm a freshman. My question is, do you think communities should forget about race?
Communities should forget about race?
No.
The panel?
So there was a movement in the 90s when I was in high school in California to remove the race question in the California census, the classification. And there's been some movements at the national level to change these things in ways that essentially allow, what you're getting at, make us want to forget about race. I want to say two things. One, when we say race, what do we mean by that? There's a difference across communities in what people mean by the term race. Some people, when you say that, mean a biological genetic entity. And other people mean a social, structural, systemic issue. And what came out of the attempt by this legislator in California to remove the race question from the California records was that in order to bring about equity, you have to count it. You have to be able to show there actually is a difference. So if you do not count the actual status difference between groups, then you do not have a recourse for change. That doesn't mean that we accept a biological genetic definition of race. So I do think that we as communities should forget about a biological, genetic, physiological understanding of race. We should erase it. But we should not forget about the structural and systemic repercussions of racism.
All right, I will take two more questions. Let's go.
My name is Dr. Jennifer Gomez. I'm a researcher at Wayne State University. I really appreciated, Mr. Rosenbaum, your conceptualization of illiteracy in Detroit as the pathology residing within the systems, within the people in power, and not upon the children and the students. My question for the entire panel is, how do you think we can guard against the University of Michigan, rich white people in Ann Arbor, racist white savior, oppressive modes of trying to help Detroit in ways that end up being harmful?
You have a question?
I'll try to answer really quick. I think we need to redefine how we conceptualize poverty and inequality to begin with. We always are insistent on managing seemingly bad decisions of poor people rather than empowering them. So, change the whole model. Stop trying to manage them, give them the resources to empower them to come up with their own decisions and define it the way they want, as well as the resources to reach it. And, that's abstract. I can list a bunch of policies, you heard me earlier, but that's the point. Redefine how we treat poverty and inequality, one away from managing poor people to empowering poor people.
All right, let's get a question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dr. Chanel D. Guzman. I manage 16 nonprofit private schools in Detroit, including down in Southwest Michigan. My question just simply is, how does the entrepreneurialism factor into addressing economic inequality, or does it?
All right, I guess I'm the economist, so I got to answer the entrepreneurial question. Willie can help you too. Oh, that's right. Do you want to start, Willie? Oh. That's the American way, right? We always go to entrepreneurship. Why don't we empower people to have businesses and things like that? To me, that's a justice issue. So from a justice standpoint, black people or people in general, no matter what subaltern group or group you come from, should have access to the ability to do entrepreneurial activity if that's what you choose. But I also think it is somewhat of a distraction from the policy discourse to really getting at issues that are important for the current economy we're in. We're no longer an agrarian society where the vast majority of people are entrepreneurial. That's just not how our economy works. Maybe we're reverting back to it with new types of labor that's also stigmatizing, with contingent employment, Uber drivers and stuff like that, but I'm not sure that's what we mean by entrepreneurship, and I'm not sure that's what we want, because that's just, workers now are responsible for their own security in ways that they haven't been in the past with things like Uber. They have to get their own health insurance, their own pensions, et cetera. But again, I guess I'm giving a twofold answer, and I'm going to conclude in a second. One is, everybody should have access to entrepreneurial activity if that's what they want to do, and that's the empowerment aspect. So it's a travesty that less than 1% of all business equity goes to black people. That's a travesty. But on the other hand, it's a distraction that every president since Nixon has said the way to improve black economic conditions is through small businesses in the black community. That's a distraction, and it's inaccurate given the current economy that we're in. So that would be my point. Yes, in the criminalization. What she said.
Okay, go ahead.
You can do it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add. I mean, I think that it is a distraction, but I would go back to your baby bonds. I think if we are going to flaunt entrepreneurship as one of the tickets out, well, they need to have the resources to actually do that in a productive way, right? If that's going to be a vehicle, we need to provide them with the resources. A lot of our conversations continue to come back around to, I'll say this quickly. I always say, you might not want me to marry your daughter, but you at least got to give me the economic opportunity to provide for my kids and my family, right? And so I can't make you love me, is my point, but I certainly at least need the opportunity to provide for my kids. And so a lot of this for me does begin with providing some economic resources for you. That doesn't solve everything, but it is something that needs to be done along with many other things. I am going to say, since everybody wants me to talk, I'll say one more thing. I am worried about our movements in that oftentimes it feels as though, and I work with National Congress of American Indians and Black Caucus groups and stuff, that we have to watch that we're not pitting ourselves against each other, right? It's not men against women. It's not that women have worse plights or men has worse plights or blacks have, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and if we don't find a way to rally together and understand, even though somebody might be suffering this and somebody suffering that we have a common ground, we gotta fight together, folks. And I think that's why we lose a lot, is because we're not fighting together, truly pulling together.
All right, let's start with you actually, because we have to round up there. Let me do this. Let me ask each of you to give me 15 seconds where we go from here.
So I'll start it off.
Okay,
so
go ahead.
In order to bring about economic justice, it starts with the politics of policy. We have to get back to the politics of this situation. We cannot leave it to a cultural revolution. We cannot leave it to a psychological revolution. And I think that that requires for us to get together at the dinner table. Technology is great, but if you don't sit down and talk to people and start to hash plans out face to face, hand to hand, we're not going to be able to build a sustainable structure, a sustainable political structure that can grant us the type of economic justice that is necessary.
All right, where do we go from here?
Well, first, Joaquin and Stephen, thank you very much for bringing us all together. I just think we need to get to know one another and care about one another, and we need each other so much. And I don't know anybody in this room, and that's my fault. And I think we talk about systemic racism. We need to find ways to have systems that put us in touch with each other, in contact with one another, not just for political efficacy, but because we're all really good people, and we deserve, all of us and our families deserve, to know one another and to be meaningful parts of each other's communities.
I'm going to let some of you off the hook, and we're going to take 2 more of these, and then I'm going to call up the best advisor that I know to give.
Well, I got the mic again. So you should know I'm not going to do that. No, I'd say I'm going to be quick again. I think we need to, the next maturation is economic rights. People talked about human rights, civil rights. Abigail mentioned it. The next maturation is really economic rights. And some ways we have to get there is obviously through a movement, and there are people on this panel that know a whole lot more about movements than me. But I think discipline, consistency, and not being afraid, getting caught up in the status quo of fear, that's a thing that destroys a movement in my view. And then the policies that get us all together, and if we talk about collectiveness, we have to be concerned about multicultural liberalism, where we talk about identities in such a way that it dissipates the meaning of identities in and of itself. but rather we need universal policies that are race and gender conscious, that at least all right, there you go.
That's great. Thank you, Professor. Go ahead.
Just one thing, I mean, very quickly, I think we need to tell full truth. I don't think we've done that in this society, and I think we need to center and listen much more closely to the voices of women of color.
All right, this has been a great panel. Hakeem Jeffries. Oh, Andrea, all right.
I'm just saying, read the Vision for Black Lives, and then I think what we were talking about is like just being together in our communities and really deeply investigating and committing to and building and experimenting on ways to keep each other safe and to meet our needs together collectively, and that will create the kinds of resistance that can then address and confront the state in the ways that we're talking about.
Let's thank Bankole and the panelists. Panelists, you can stay put. Bankole, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm going to call up my advisor, who's not only supported all of my sort of academic visions, but also has been very supportive of this event. He is Stephen and my advisor, Professor Vince Hutchings.
Thank you for that introduction, Hakeem. I know it's been a long day, so I'll make my comments very brief here. Others have already done this, so I want to, however, nevertheless do it as well, which is to say thank Stephen Moore and Hakeem Jefferson. Hakeem, a moment ago, mentioned that I am the academic advisor of both of these great students here, and that might give some of you the impression in this room that I had something to do with this event. Let me assure you it did not. I had nothing to do with this event, not because I'm not proud of everything that they've accomplished, but because I don't want to steal any of their thunder. It's been completely conceived of, executed, and kind of developed by the two of them. And I simply stood on the sidelines and watched. So, so what is my task here? I think Hakeem wanted me to lay out the blueprint for the revolution. Is that right? No, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do in the next minute or two, because I know we're all ready to break here, is to try to draw out some of the themes that I took from this wonderful event. I was present for the entirety of it. And, you know, I get paid to study questions of race and inequality, and not just in the context of political science. I'm a political scientist by training. But I try to be interdisciplinary in my approach to these questions. So I like to think of myself as relatively learned in this arena. Having said all that, I learned a lot today. There was plenty that I had not been exposed to previously, a lot that I learned from the wonderful panelists here on stage. And the themes that I'm going to draw out here very briefly, just kind of highlight without mentioning names, because if I mentioned one or two, I would feel as if I gave short shrift to someone else. So these are some of the themes, and there are really 7 or 8 of them, that I think were mentioned by at least more than one panelist this morning and afternoon, and something for us to think about as we leave this event. The importance that we should attach to these various issues. The first of which is about, and in no particular order really, the importance of education. Education is something that is worth pursuing in its own right and has powerful, obviously we're having this conversation at a university, so underscoring the importance of education, yet recognizing the limitations of education and its inadequacy as a tool by which to address inequality. It can get us some of the way, but it can't get us all of the way. That was one of the themes that I at least took from the panelists earlier today. Another theme that I want to highlight is the importance of structural power. The implementation and the execution of structural power as opposed to individual animus as a feature that is important in cementing and reinforcing inequality. It's easy to focus on Charlottesville, for example, and the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and what's often overlooked, the neo-Confederates who showed up at that event. These are people that it's easy, the first two that I mentioned, neo-Nazis and white supremacists, are quite marginalized in 2018. Neo-Confederates actually are not marginalized. And that's partly why they're often overlooked when people talk about Charlottesville. So I just wanted to get that in there. But even granting all of that, the structural constraints that the panelists made reference to is arguably perhaps more important than all the neo-Nazis that one can identify. And there are more than a few, as it turns out. The importance of police discretion in contributing to police abuse of power, the inherent kind of discretion that's embedded in the exercise of police power. That was something that was kind of highlighted by a number of the speakers today, and so I think it's something to think about as we think about ways to resolve some of these longstanding problems. Additionally, the importance of thinking beyond what seems politically feasible at the moment. It's easy to think that we shouldn't grapple on, or I should say grab onto solutions that seem less than plausible in our current political environment. And I understand why people might do that, but many of the panelists push back on that notion by suggesting that we should be prepared to think outside the box. Indeed, had not some group of people been prepared to think outside the box, people like myself would not be in a position today to stand up at this podium to make these kinds of comments. That is to say, I'm referencing, if you haven't gotten the point, that it seemed politically far-fetched at one period in American history to contemplate the abolition of slavery. But some far-sighted individuals thought maybe we should pursue that anyway, and all of you know how that story ends, I think. The importance of the racial empathy gap in contributing to the indifference, the willful blindness, and the tepid support for shocking levels of racial and class inequality and gender inequality that has been highlighted on this panel. So what I'm drawing your attention to here is, again, this notion that it isn't just the frothing at the mouth neo-Nazis who we should be concerned about, although we should be concerned about those folks, but the individuals via their tacit support, their willful ignorance, and their indifference, who allow such inequities to continue. And I think another theme that I want to bring your attention to, and I'm almost done here, would be the importance of the power of gatekeepers. Gatekeepers of a variety of different sorts in shaping and maintaining inequality. Inequality in the context of health outcomes, inequality in the context of wealth inequalities, the vast racial wealth gap, inequalities with respect to criminal justice outcomes, environmental injustice, educational injustice, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of gatekeepers, be they police officers, politicians, bureaucrats of a variety of different stripes, who contribute to these outcomes, even though they may not do so in a way that's easily labeled racist, whatever that word means. So gatekeepers. And I guess finally, the theme that I thought was really important to end on, or at least in my comments on this afternoon, is the importance of, as one of the panelists indicated, telling the truth. If we're engaged in nothing, if this effort by Stephen and Hakeem to organize this event has been about anything, it's about telling the truth. Telling the truth not just in the truth, speaking truth to power sense of the word, although that's important, but for those who are kind of what Malcolm X would have called the victims of democracy. Speaking truth so that they are familiar with the information, that they can be armed with the information to go out and to fight the good fight. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So that's what we have, friends. Thank you so much.